here to bring a new type of news show.
New insights, new style, and new topic every day.
We are News Generation.
Bring news just for you. It's Friday, October 18th here in Seoul. I'm Song Yujin, and you're watching News Generation. Today, we're joined by Cheska Dainhong.
Happy Friday, everyone!
Happy Friday! And we have very exciting news. We're joined by a new panelist today. He is Lee Wonbin. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Eugene. Hello, everyone. My name is Wonbin. I also go by Michael. I lived in Canada for 6 years and I came back to Korea to teach English. I'm also making content on social media. And I would really like to thank Arirang and the NewsGen staff crews for giving me an amazing opportunity today.
Well, thank you for joining us, Wonbin.
Thank you again.
Now, both are here to speak on behalf of those in their 20s and 30s. So we're going to move on to our main discussion of the day. With our fall reshuffle, every Friday we'll now be exploring topics and issues that resonate with young people around the world. And for our first topic for this Friday is one that has sparked debate for years, especially in Western cultures, and that is now tipping. Now, especially in the United States, the debate around how much to tip and whether tipping should even be necessary has been heating up lately, especially among our generation, right, Cheska?
Yes, and I can definitely speak for someone who has lived in the States for quite a while.
Right.
Tipping has long been a part of the Western culture. And the most recent trip I made back to New York, we were tipping to up about 25%.
It has gone up quite a lot, right?
Quite a lot. And especially when the economy starts to take a hit, adding a tip to an already priced or inflation price can be really burdensome for the consumers. So there are terms such as the tipflation, which is tip plus inflation, or tip exhaustion, which means you are really exhausted to pay the price adding onto the tip among young MZers, especially those working part-time jobs, as they are paid the minimum wage and really have to make up for that gap, and most of it from the tips. But if you think about it, it's really burdensome on both sides, the customers and the part-timers, because if you think about it, the price is already, very hefty for the consumers. But if you add the tip on top of that, you don't know how much it can rake up to.
Definitely.
Yeah, so there is definitely a lot of controversy surrounding that nowadays. Yeah.
Right, and rising prices is not the only reason why the younger generation, especially in the United States, are feeling the burden of tipping. Now, Wonbin, technology seems to have also added to the pressure of tipping, right?
Yes, that is correct. It seems like compared to the past, the younger generations are finding tips more unreasonable and unjustifiable than before, since a lot of work that used to be done by people has been either simplified or even automated with the use of technologies such as kiosks and self-checkout, which is the opposite direction of the rising rate of tips. Many people question why kiosks or self-checkout machines are out there asking for a tip when we are the ones doing all the work. I mean, like, who are we tipping when we're doing all the work, right?
Exactly. The electricity.
Although everything is going up in price, the increasing rate of tips is more bothersome than other categories, since it forces us to feel guilty and morally wrong to not to, due to the way the transaction is made. For example, when you get the card reader at a restaurant to pay your bills, you need to decide the percentage of the tip that you give.
When the waiter is standing in front of you.
Yeah, usually it's 15 to 25%, and the waiter is standing right in front of you with like a big smile. Yeah, and again, like, there's nothing to blame them or criticize them. It's part of their job. But in the customer's perspective, it is very difficult to not tip, to say the least.
Right. So it kind of makes a lot of consumers feel obliged to tip, especially under these circumstances, and especially these days when machines such as kiosks are doing a lot of things that waiters or people who provide services at the restaurants used to do. Now, so far, we've mostly been looking at this issue from the consumer's point of view. Now, for a more balanced perspective, we're now going to invite a restaurant owner from the United States to our talks today. Joining us today is Ryan Phillips, a chef and organic farmer. Welcome, Ryan, to the show.
Hi, guys. How you doing today?
We're doing great. Happy Friday, Ryan. Right, so our first question.
Same to you.
Thank you. Now, our first question for you, Ryan, is we can see that you're currently at your restaurant. So do you also have a tipping system at your place as well? And if so, how does it work?
Here in Korea, we can't really do that. It's just not commonplace. Now, what we can do is put out a jar and write tips on it. And if people feel like giving something extra, then so be it. That I'm seeing a little more and more of here in Korea the last few years.
You know, Ryan, much like myself, you have lived in the States and now you're doing a business here in South Korea. So from your perspective, as a business owner who has lived in both culture, what would you say are the biggest pros and cons of tipping?
Well, I love tipping actually.
Okay.
I think it's a great way to say thank you for good service.
Yeah.
And when you're in the States and you go to a nice restaurant, you know, I think it's a beautiful thing. Now, what you guys were already saying about the kiosks, like when you go get a cup of coffee and all they do is turn around and pour a cup, like they pull a lever, fill up a cup, turn around, hand it to you, and then the machine is saying, "Hey, do you want to give $2, $5, $8, whatever?" I find that kind of frustrating and a little bit ridiculous.
I see, Ryan. So, what are your thoughts on the ongoing debate around tipping and the concept of tipflation?
Well, it has gotten a little bit out of control, you know. But when it comes to just restaurants where you have a server and they're coming and they're doing a good job, I love the ability to show gratitude financially, and back, I guess, you know, 20 something years ago, I was a server, so I'm biased.
Right.
You know, I love coming home with cash. And definitely, you know that the servers, as far as hourly wage, at least back then, it was less than $3 an hour, for what the restaurant was paying you. I'm also biased because, you know, the restaurant then doesn't have to fork over a whole lot of cash to pay those servers. It's pushed onto the consumer. And I know that sounds crazy to some people, but I grew up in a place where that's normal and you go to restaurants expecting it. And I guess that's what it really all comes down to is expectations versus, you know, what happens.
Definitely. All right, Ryan, thank you so much for your time today and hope you have a great Friday.
Thanks. You too, guys. Have a great one.
Thank you. Right, so as Ryan just mentioned, in Korea, in South Korea, we don't traditionally or typically have a tipping culture at restaurants or cafes, but we're starting to see some places introduce something similar to tipping. So I want to ask you, Cheska, how has the general public responded to this shift?
So Ryan mentioned something really interesting, and I actually noticed this in a couple of, should I say, fancy or modern cafes that have been sort of popping up. They do have a tipping jar, even in South Korea. But it's not forced upon, and I see people like leaving a little bit of cash in there too. So one of the things that I personally loved about Korea when I first came back to Seoul is that you pay what is written on the
you
price
can expect
tag.
what you're going to pay.
Exactly. So you don't have to do the mental calculation of like, okay, so now the coffee's $4, but I actually have to pay $150 extra, so the actual price is more than that. But recently, the Kakao taxi service added something called the gratitude tip, which is like saying thank you. But this has sparked some controversy, and the general public's opinion has long been against tipping culture. And especially the people in their 20s had the strongest opposition of like 80% against tipping in a certain survey. And I just want to point out that I don't think it has to do with the fact that we lack, you know, humanity or empathy. But as Ryan mentioned, I think it has to do with the fact that we're just not used to it. We did not grow up in a culture where we had to pay extra for the prices or the services that received. So when it is added onto the already hefty price or inflated price, we feel like there's a money being taken out of us in an unjustifiable way. So I think it's just a difference of experience.
Yeah, it's probably because we're not accustomed to tipping.
Exactly.
This is indeed a fairly new culture, consumer culture here in Korea. Now, Wonbin, are there any other examples that you'd like to share more with our viewers?
Yes, definitely. Some cafes, like Cheska mentioned, some cafes and restaurants in Korea are placing a tip box, which has surprised many consumers in Korea. As we all know, tipping is not a common culture in Korea, and you guys may know, but it's even sometimes considered rude if you do. So, for example, if you enjoy your service, if you try to tip the staff, and if you bring your wallet out, everybody would be like,
"Oh, what are you doing?"
Whoa, 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 yeah, we can't take that. And I also feel like as a person who would be taking the tip, in Korea, we have a bit of a cultural difference where we have like the sense of morality of wanting to take more money from other people is kind of greedy. So it's considered less natural. And due to the differences in law, not always, but tipping can even be illegal in circumstances.
Right. So this public response that we're seeing, especially from the younger generation here in Korea, could come from a different culture that we're not used to. As once again, tipping is a new culture here in Korea. Now, so far, we've mainly focused and discussed about the situation in the United States and Korea so far, but let's kind of broaden our discussion and take a look at the tipping cultures in other cultures. For example, let's start with neighboring Asian countries.
I think that's a great place to start because, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think Koreans are used to tipping, and this includes a lot of East Asian countries as well. And you know, something sparked a little idea in me when Wonbin mentioned the idea of morality. I think a lot of East Asian cultures follow the Confucius principle.
Right.
So I think it's quite interesting when Wonbin mentioned that there's a morality perspective to it. I don't think we're very comfortable taking more
money
than what we're supposed to. So even if it's out of a thank you, as Ryan mentioned, in a Western culture where it is kind of common to pay respect in a form of capital, I think in East Asian culture it is a sign of greed or maybe, you know, not too much when it's more than what you asked for. So perhaps that could be way. I also heard that India, they do have a tipping culture of about 7 to 10% tip. In America, I can speak for sure, it goes up as high as 25 or even more when they're really generous and want to tip very hefty. It's such as other countries like in Europe, Italy, England, and Spain. I've never lived there, but when I was traveling, they did have a tipping culture, but it seemed more of out of like courtesy and mannerism rather than being completely forced upon. But I could be wrong because I was only a visitor to those countries.
Then I also want to ask the same question to Wonbin. What's the situation like in other countries?
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, tipping is a very common practice in US and Canada as well.
Where you lived?
In North America, yes. And it usually, tipping is considered common in restaurants, especially local dining places and cafes as well. However, in most franchises, like other McDonald's or Burger King, it's not a common practice to tip. In Mexico, tipping is also considered common. Ranging from 10 to 20% as tourism has developed. However, surprisingly, what I've heard from my friends is that in Australia and New Zealand, which is where Cheska's from, they told me that tipping is actually not common there.
Oh, very interesting. So we're kind of seeing differences between cultures, but it's true that a lot of countries have tipping cultures at restaurants, cafes, and so much more. Now, let's kind of take a step back and kind of think about when and how did this tipping culture begin? Because I think that this has been here for quite a long time, right?
Yeah. This is such an interesting question. And thanks to Eugene, I actually had to do a historical research on how did tipping even start. And we can go back so far back as to the Roman era. So we're talking about like
very ancient
medieval Europe, when wealthy visitors to homes would actually leave cash tips to servants who provided good service. But the jargon tip, the TIP word, actually dates to the 17th century when London taverns and coffee house would put up signs that literally read, to ensure promptitude. Ensure, yeah.
Tip.
Exactly. Promptitude, TIP. Sounds so English, doesn't it? To ensure promptitude.
That's very interesting.
And they would have like boxes or bowls where customers could leave an extra coin or, you know, for faster service. So I think that's where the tip box kind of started. Yeah.
Wow, I learned something new. I thought that the tipping culture was like centuries old, but it's actually more than a millennial old. So it's been here for a very long time. So to Wonbin, I want to ask you, how has this tipping culture continued to continue for such a long time?
Yeah, so like Cheska said, since the tipping culture started millennials ago, it was able to continue until now because if we look into the recent history, at the end of the Civil War in 1865, I had to do some research as well. Yes. The labor force was flooded with formerly enslaved people and immigrants, and employers were trying to take advantage of this situation and pay them a very low wage. And they were trying to encourage the customers to kind of contribute with compensating the staffs. And surprisingly, it was able to be continued because wealthy Americans really like to mimic what Europeans did in the past. So they somehow saw that Europeans were tipping and showing generosity, and wealthy Americans started to follow that as well.
I see. Hope our viewers got to learn about the history of tipping.
We definitely
We did.
Sure, for sure.
And one of the big reasons why, once again, we brought this topic today is because although this tipping culture has been here for more than a millennial, our generation is kind of questioning how much is the appropriate amount of tipping and whether to tip or not. So once again, going back to what our generation think, is our generation generally for tipping or are they kind of against it?
That's a very interesting question because I think, as the saying goes, when in Rome, do the Romans. So I do know that because our generation travels a lot and we are more worldly, I know a lot of my friends and people that travel to these countries where tipping culture is mandatory. They try to follow the rules, but when they come back to the home country, which is South Korea, I don't think we're very used to it for the reasons that we mentioned throughout the day. But if tipping is a part of the culture, I try to comply because as Ryan mentioned, I do believe that tipping has some benefits in terms of showing not only generosity, but really thank you for the
service,
for the good service that I received. But if it becomes mandatory, and if it comes to a point where it's not out of gratitude, but to avoid embarrassment, or when you're enforced to do it, when you don't really feel like complying, then I think it gets a little bit too tricky.
I think that's when the confusion and the frustration begins.
Yes, exactly. Because I definitely have received services where I did not feel particularly, prone to tipping, but because it was mandated, I had to, out of just to save face, to be honest.
And what about you, Wonmi? What do you think?
So most millennials and Gen Zs, including me, tend to have a sense of frustration when we talk about the tipping culture. Obviously, it is a good way to show appreciation of the service that you're getting. However, it comes with too many things to worry about compared to the past. For example, some situations where your actions highly reflect who you are. For example, if you're going on a lovely first date, or if you're having lunch with your coworker or your boss on your first day of work, it can get very awkward when you're trying to decide how much you're going to tip. And because of these reasons, most millennials and Gen Zs feel like compared to the pros that we have when it comes to tipping, there are more cons that makes the situation uncomfortable.
And now to listen to more of viewers in our generation, we also ran a poll on our Arirang.news YouTube channel to ask viewers their thoughts on tipping. And let's take a look at what some of them had to say. So the survey was conducted between October 10th to 16th. And when asked, how do you feel about tipping culture? Positive was 26%, and those who thought tipping culture was negative was 74%. So we can see that our generation is kind of leaning a bit more towards being opposed to tipping. If we look at some of the opinions, good service is worth tipping. One of our viewers also said tipping is supposed to be done in appreciation for a job well done. It's not supposed to be obligatory as the waiters and waitresses are being paid a wage. So I think that as both of you guys mentioned, if tipping is, when you kind of feel that tipping, you have to tip, or you kind of feel obliged, that's when the kind of question, is tipping necessary or not? So I think this all comes down to this.
Because I think when you're forced to do something, it loses that extra touch of it being an appreciation or out of good heart. Because now you're just doing it, not necessarily to service the other person.
Because you kind of feel that you have to.
Exactly. And like I said, when it comes to you doing it to save face or to avoid embarrassment or like you not knowing what to do, then I think it really loses the essence of tipping, which is probably why people nowadays are getting a little bit confused and frustrated because it has gotten to a point where it lost the meaning of showing gratitude, I think, in my personal opinion.
Do you also agree to what Cheska mentioned, Wonbin?
Yeah, I do. When it comes to tipping, I believe that we need to look into the origin of this culture. Like Cheska said, it was meant to show appreciation and generosity to the person helping you. However, nowadays, it seems like it kind of transformed into a situation where it's like break even or take a loss. Because if you do tip, it's considered standard. However, if you don't, you become a douche. So
that's a great way to put it.
While demolishing the entire culture could be difficult, I think we can make some changes and pivot this culture into a healthier direction. One example that I kind of came up with is to make like a lighter tipping option, whereas like a 7 or 10%, where it would be less stressful for the consumers, for those who are not financially comfortable to tip the standard amount. The key factor in this would be making this lighter option socially acceptable and okay to do.
Right. And from your point of view, Cheska, is there any way you think that the tipping culture should be headed?
I really think that South Korea, because of the way that we have lived, the cultural background, and the way that we have been educated, maybe implementing tipping culture would be difficult for people to accept. I mean, we saw it in the survey today. But listening to all the conversations on different sides from Ryan and Wonbin, I really think there might be something that we can do which is in the middle, where it is optional, but you can say, it's kind of like a thank you note, but it's like a thank you tipping. So you don't have to necessarily pay, but there's a way to show gratitude in one form or another. And I think that might be our Korean way of saying thank you, but in a way that doesn't have to be a monetary enforcement. Yeah, it can be just a message, or it can be just, maybe a couple of bucks. But, making it optional so that people don't feel enforced, I think would be the best way to go.
Yeah, I think tipping comes from very good will and very good purpose. So maybe we can kind of adjust and create our own tipping culture.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah, something between like monetary and like a thank you card.
Right. Now, I hope our discussion helped you understand more about tipping. And that's all from us today, but Newsgen will be back next Monday at 10:30 a.m. Korea time. Special thanks today to Cheska Dainhong.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you.
Thank you. And Iwon Bin.
Thank you again.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for watching, and hope you have a nice weekend. We are News Generation.